guess now would be a good time to get started if you are all ready. And excited to see you all here. My name is Alan Scott, and I am tired. Last night, a ranchera band decided that 3 a.m. was a good time to do a jam session in the hotel room right next to mine, accordion and all. And it took about 2 hours for security with multiple reminders to get them to quiet down. So anyway, if I seem a little droopy today, let me know. I mean, there's a reason for it. I'm excited to be here today despite my tiredness. I am a recovering architect and sustainability consultant. I've been doing that for a number of years, and excited to share some of my perspectives on resilience in building. Just a little bit of context. I write a monthly column in Metal Architecture magazine, so be sure to check out my work there. I am currently vice chair of the U.S. Green Building Council's lead resilience working group, and also serve on the American Institute of Architects Resilience and Adaptation Advisory group. So I'm very engaged in this topic of resilience, and excited to engage you in it as well. Is my clicker working? Oh, forgot to push the on button. Today we're going to be covering a range of topics relative to resilience. I want to talk about what it means and how it applies. And the important thing that I want you to take away from this is whether this is something, resilience is something that's going to be impacting your business. It will be something that's impacting your clients and customers that they might be asking you for. And it might be something that's impacting you at a personal level in your home or your work. So there's lots of different ways, and we're going to explore those. And throughout this next hour, I invite you to ask lots of questions, and so feel free to pipe in. I should have allowed some time for questions at the end as well. If you feel you're not inspired to ask them during the session, we'll have some time at the end. So words matter. Disaster implies something that is unanticipated and unavoidable. I prefer the word hazard because a hazard is something that you can anticipate and prepare for ahead of time to prevent it from becoming a disaster. The trouble is that we humans are not very good at assessing the risks from hazards that might be facing us and acting on them accordingly. So we are challenged with that, and so that's going to be a theme that we come back to today. Did you know that 54% of Americans are afraid of sharks? This is probably due to sensationalization of shark attacks in news media and entertainment. But this is not a hazard that's likely to happen to you. As a matter of fact, globally, only 6 people are killed in unprovoked shark attacks in the entire world. By contrast, humans kill an estimated 100 million sharks or more every year, so they have a lot more reasons to be afraid of us than we are of them. But that's a different talk. By contrast, 8 people die every day in the US alone due to distracted driving. Now, many of us might be concerned about this to some degree or another, but not enough to prevent us from driving, and maybe more importantly, not enough to prevent us from our own distracted driving habits when we're on the road. I know I'm sometimes guilty too, although in learning this, I've begun to change my wicked ways. So this contrast points out two key concepts from behavioral science that are kind of fundamental to our assessment and action on risk. The first is called the availability heuristic, that describes our tendency to use to judge the probability of something happening based on our ability to imagine it happening or our experience with it happening in the past. So we use imaginability and memorability as quick tools to assess the likelihood of something happening. The second is the the optimism bias, which is that we tend to think there's a greater chance or there's less chance of something bad happening to us compared to the chance of that bad thing happening to someone else. So it's not that we're overall not very good about judging risk, it's that we're not very good about judging the risk to ourselves. So essentially these two things boil down to the fact that we use gut level feelings as opposed to data and rational thought to judge risk and decide which risk to act on. And in most cases in everyday life, this serves us well because we don't have time when we're about to cross a busy street to judge, calculate the speed and distance of all the cars coming at us, and we don't have time and ability to do engineering calculations on a rickety ladder before we have a chance to climb it. So there's lots of reasons why gut level assessments are necessary in everyday life. Unfortunately, sometimes those lead us astray. And one of those situations is related to climate change, which we, both individually and collectively, are not acting on with the appropriate level relative to the risk that we face from it. One of the reasons is that oftentimes climate change is talked about relative to distant events like sea level rise at the end of the century. This is so far removed from where we're at, I think most of us might not expect to be alive then, and so it's too distant for us to recognize as a real risk that we need to act on, absorb what it means to us, and take necessary action. But the reality is that climate change is here and now. Case in point, the deadly heat domes that lingered over much of the northern hemisphere for this last summer, and 2023 is now officially the hottest summer ever recorded. And extreme heat is one of the deadliest of natural disasters, so there's real reason to be concerned. Data tells us that the frequency and severity of natural hazards has increased significantly in recent years. And as a matter of fact, just as of the end of September, 2023 has already exceeded the previous record for billion-dollar plus natural hazards in the United States. And of course, if we looked at global statistics, they'd be the same. So the impact is happening now and is significant from financial as well as human terms. But we still have sort of trouble grasping and acting on this, and part of that's because we are thinking about things that have happened in the past, and the past performance is not necessarily what we can anticipate now and in the future. So there are three things that I see happening relative to our challenges with the way that we're assessing risks. One of those is that our emergency management systems are based on our experience with individual hazard events that we've experienced in the past, and so we plan around those and not necessarily those that are currently affecting us and those that might affect us in the near future. So we're driving rapidly towards a brave new world of climate change, looking squarely in the rearview mirror. The second is that we tend to think about one hazard at a time when we think about hazard preparation, and we don't think about the cascading and compounding impacts of multiple hazards that might be interrelated and happen at the same time. One example of this is that a prolonged drought might be affecting us, and oftentimes that might occur along with some extreme heat events like we experienced this last summer. Well, droughts can lead to water shortages in thermoelectric power plants that need water for cooling, causing some of those to have to be shut down just at the time that we need more power for air conditioning in an extreme heat event. A similar event like this happened several times in recent years in France with their nuclear power plants not having enough water for cooling. Extreme heat events can also spawn storms that would lightning storms and high winds that can spark wildfires with lightning and down power lines. Those wildfires can then threaten structures locally, as well as create outdoor air quality problems at hazardous levels and more broadly in our region. And all of these things are interconnected. Tragically, the heartbreaking events that happened in Lahaina, Maui this last summer are an example of cascading and compounding hazards, and there are many other examples like that. So we need to think about these interconnections. The third thing I wanted to talk about is our tendency to focus on acute hazards. On acute hazards and not necessarily the chronic ones that are slowly developing, like those associated with climate change. One example of this is Mexico City, that has done a lot to prepare for the frequent earthquakes that they experience, but they have a looming water crisis, and if they don't change their practices, they're facing a potential zero water day in 5 years or less. But yet water conservation practices are not yet common in Mexico City with new development and renovations to existing developments. Can you think of another place that might have an issue with this? So we need to be thinking ahead at those changes. So climate advocates sometimes debate the need to focus on climate mitigation versus climate adaptation. And with the adaptation proponents suggesting that suggests that we're giving up on mitigating the impacts of climate change. The reality is that we need to do both at the same time and as fast as possible. The benefit is that there are many sustainability strategies that are synergistic that address and help build resilience at a building scale and at a community scale that also serve to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and help with climate change mitigation. So those strategies can go together. When we talk about risk assessment relative to climate change adaptation, we talk about two types of risks. One is transitional risks. Transitional risks are those associated with regulatory and economic factors associated with climate change. Those are things like building performance standards, like Local Law 97 in New York, that's requiring existing building owners to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions or face fines. Building performance standards are coming to other parts of the country as well. Other things like risk disclosure, that I'm going to touch on in greater detail later, and litigation and carbon pricing as well. Physical risks, as the name implies, are associated with the damage to structures or infrastructure from natural hazard events and associated with climate change. And there are a number of factors that go into evaluating what those physical risks are and how significant they are for a particular location. And so I want to spend some time talking about that. When we talk about risk and vulnerability to climate change, risk is a factor of the severity of an event and the probability of it happening. Those two things go together to form risk. And when we talk about vulnerability, we're looking at the sensitivity we have or our exposure to a hazard event mitigated or magnified by our ability to adapt or lack of ability to adapt to that potential vulnerability. So let me illustrate this really quickly, getting back to our example of shark attacks and distracted driving. There is no doubt that a shark attack would be very severe. I mean, just look at the teeth. But the probability, as we discussed, is very low, so we have a relatively low risk of shark attack. And unless we are regularly do spearfishing in prime shark habitat, our sensitivity to that is low because our exposure is not low because we're not around sharks very much. And we're able to adopt, if we're in the water, we're able to adapt techniques to make ourselves less of a target. And so we have overall low vulnerability to that as well. Now when we talk about distracted driving, whether we're the driver of the vehicle or the person that they might hit, our risk is, severity of risk is pretty high from an accident. And we know that the probability is, medium to high, so we have an overall higher risk of potential from distracted driving. And unless we never drive, bike, or walk down a street, we have exposure to distracted drivers. And while we can adapt our own behaviors and avoid distracted driving and drive defensively, we can't control the bad behaviors of others, and so we have a medium to low adaptability to that hazard, giving us a higher vulnerability generally. Now, this is an important part of looking at both risk and vulnerability relative to how we assess what we should act on. That is part of the question, but we also need to be looking at strategies, collective strategies to address and mitigate those risks and vulnerabilities collectively. And the trouble is that we often act in silos. So in the absence of a public effort to increase resilience, some individuals might invest in their own personal resilience, and they will come through a hazard event unscathed, but then they might find themselves castaways surrounded by a devastated community, and maybe they wouldn't want to continue living there. Conversely, yes, there it is. That was a slow transition. Conversely, a municipality's public entities can invest in hardening infrastructure and in emergency management planning. However, individual homeowners and businesses may not perceive the risk and take action accordingly, or they might assume that the government and insurance companies will take care of them if a hazard event happens, which is not always the case. And so you're left with, what good is resilient infrastructure if there's no community left to serve? So we need to be thinking about collective and coordinated efforts to create resilience at all scales in our communities and in our businesses and homes. So to want to sort of illustrate a contrast of how this works. If we have a low resilience community and a hazard event occurs, homeowners and businesses may find that they're uninsured or underinsured, and that they can't get the financing to rebuild, and so many of them might choose to leave. When they leave, the tax base is reduced and local services are diminished. The community then begins to look risky to insurance companies and investors, and they pull back, spiraling the community down further. Even if they do get money to rebuild, oftentimes time is of the essence. And so with limited funds and limited time, rebuilding is usually done the way it was before, as opposed to building in greater resilience. And then the community is setting itself up for another disaster the next time a hazard hits. So conversely, if we make proactive investments in resilience, this attracts more investment, reduces risks, and leads to greater prosperity in a community. Regardless of resilience, recovery can take a while. One of the examples I'd like to share of this is Christchurch, Aotearoa, or New Zealand, as most people know it, that faced a devastating earthquake in 2011. Now, 185 people died in this earthquake, mostly in 2 buildings in the central business district that collapsed. The rest of the buildings did what they were supposed to do relative to code. They stood up, they didn't collapse on people's heads, protected life safety. However, 70% of those buildings were damaged beyond repair. And these two side-by-side photos show the comparison. 1 month afterwards, downtown looks pretty much the way it did before the earthquake, but many of those buildings were damaged. 5 years down the road, they've had to demolish those buildings because they could not be repaired, but they haven't rebuilt them, so the vitality of downtown is wiped clean along with that demolition, and it's taken them years to recover from this. So the key point there is that building codes are not the same as resilience. Building codes are meant to protect life and safety during hazard events so that people can stay in the building and get out alive, but it doesn't necessarily define optimal performance of the building from a resilience standpoint. And it's a lot like the design of modern automobiles. They have crumple zones built into the frames so that in a collision, the force of the impact is absorbed by the crumple zone, sparing the occupants a lot of the force of the collision and hopefully saving their lives. But afterwards, it's pretty darn hard to fix the car, and so it's totaled and you get a new car. Similar thing happens with code versus resilience in buildings. When we think about building in resilience proactively, the key is that a high resilience community with both infrastructure and buildings that are more resilient will bounce back quickly after a hazard event and can even think about learning from what went wrong and rebuilding with even greater resilience over time, whereas a low resilience community has to go an arduous and slow recovery process, or worse, a community with little or no resilience that may never recover after a hazard event. So this is just to emphasize the point about individual and collective action working together. One example of a community taking that type of proactive action is this San Francisco Bay Area. They have a 72% chance of a severe earthquake in the next 20 years, and they have 650 kilometers of urban shoreline at risk from sea level rise. One particular area of vulnerability is the San Francisco Embarcadero. They have a 100-year-old seawall that's built on silt. In the major earthquake, it is going to topple into the bay, and part of the financial district is going to slide into the water with it. That is, if sea level rise doesn't top the wall first. So the public entities in San Francisco are engaging with public and business in a comprehensive effort to build a more resilient waterfront in San Francisco ahead of these hazards events happening, so they do not face tragedy. And so that's what I consider smart investment in resilience. The National Institutes of Building Science estimates that for every dollar you invest in resilience, you save $4 to $11 or more after a hazard event. The key is that you need to invest those dollars wisely in the risks and vulnerabilities that are most significant for a particular building asset location, and not willy-nilly. So assessment, and as opposed to gut level assessment is detailed assessment versus gut level assessment is necessary to achieve that. One of the foundations in the United States for that risk assessment is the FEMA National Risk Index, which at a census tract level identifies the potential severity of multiple types of hazard events: tornadoes, high winds, hurricanes, floods, wildfire, earthquake, all of the major players in natural hazards are covered in that risk index. And so that's a good place to start with a foundation of current risks facing particular locations. But it's also important to look at future risks. And so we can look at future risks based on climate models with the various representative concentration pathways of Paris Accord compliance, business as usual, or something in between. So here's an example of expectations for extreme heat, the increases in ambient temperatures from extreme heat in various concentration pathways and scenarios. And so we can look at that for various types of hazards like drought, flooding, and extreme heat, looking into the future. A key example of why we need to get data from multiple sources, though, is because we can't count on one source necessarily identifying significant hazards. In this case, this is some maps coming out of a tool called Risk Footprint by a company called Coastal Risk that's looking at flooding. The upper map shows the FEMA floodplain map for riverine flooding for this particular example property. And they're in the zone X, which is above the 500-year floodplain, so they're relatively safe from riverine flooding. However, pluvial flooding or heavy rain event flooding is a potential issue by looking at other data sets, and we can see that this property is potentially subject to flooding from heavy rain events, and so we might need to address that with a civil engineering approach that wouldn't have been revealed just looking at a FEMA flood map. Similarly, we need to look ahead, not just behind, at potential risks. In this particular property, right now they're experiencing, adjacent to the property, about 8 days a year of some minor coastal flooding. But the indications are within 17 years, they'll have 85 days a year of fairly severe coastal flooding, so they will need kayaks as opposed to cars to get to this property. And knowing that and planning ahead for what can they do to increase resilience, both in the streets and access ways as well as in the building, will be important to keep the viability of that property and that neighborhood. So I want to back up a moment, and I mentioned about some of the things that are driving us to be concerned about resilience besides our own personal safety. And I want to run down and share with you a few of those trends and some things that are happening that will make resilience relevant to all of us in multiple ways. The Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure is a framework for financial and investment world to be thinking about what are the climate risks that affect the finances, and more countries are adopting that as a requirement for reporting in financial institutions. And the thing is that then they're going to be looking for who are we making loans to and what are the risks associated with those loans. So building loans, real estate loans, other things like that fall into that. And so that's pushing climate risk disclosure to be more at the forefront. And the European Union has recently adopted the EU taxonomy, which raises the bar on that type of disclosure. So companies that are working, European-based companies that are selling in the United States are going to be looking at some of those climate risks across the puddle. So it's becoming an international piece. The Security and Exchange Commission, or SEC, has some pending rules for publicly traded companies in the United States. Those are expected within the next few months or within the next year to take effect. And so that climate financial disclosure is going to be coming to the United States soon. And California just passed Senate Bill 261, which actually goes a little bit further than the SEC rule that's pending and requires companies with $1 billion more that doing business in California to do climate risk reporting starting next year. A few other ones that I wanted to mention, the ASTM is working on a new standard for property resilience assessment, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, but that's a standard for how you do risk assessment that we're talking about that's coming up. And in terms of voluntary standards, LEED version 5, which was the existing building version was just released last month, and the new construction version will be released next year, is incorporating climate risk assessment and other elements of resilience into a voluntary rating system for buildings. The U.S. Resilience Council has had a seismic standard for buildings out for a while, and as well as ARUP developed the READY standard for engineering resilience in buildings, and so some other voluntary standards and certifications are available. The ASTM standard, while still in development, is going to address 3 steps involved in a risk assessment. First, doing a hazard screening. What hazards are most significant in an area? What are the specific risks and vulnerabilities associated with those hazards? And then a third step, identifying the resilience measures that will help to mitigate those hazards. This standard is primarily focused on real estate due diligence transactions. So as similar to a property condition assessment, real estate investors and their financing, the banks that are making loans to them will be requiring these type of assessments in transfers of property. But the assessment process would apply to a building owner of an asset they intend to hold on to, going through steps to assess the resilience of their own property and make appropriate measures. Assessment tools like risk footprint are useful in doing this because they aggregate multiple data sets and make it easy for us to do a multi-hazard assessment for both current and future risks. And then we can step back and make the judgment which one of these are most material to a particular location, which ones do we need to act on, and which ones are not very likely that maybe we can back burner for a little while. Another aspect about resilience that I think is important is architects and their role in resilience in designing new buildings and as well as renovating existing buildings. The HGA architects, and along with the University of Minnesota, did a study this last year looking at how many architects are actually incorporating climate risk and resilience into their design practices, and not very many are. However, back in 2018, the AIA updated their codes of ethics and professional conduct to include a responsibility for looking at climate change impacts to their clients in the buildings that they're designing for them. And so it's becoming part of the architect's standard of care. Just to put a finer point on this, I attended a presentation recently by an attorney who works in construction-related law, and although most insurance companies and people who deal with risk talk about force majeure, or the acts of God, and the things we can't foresee, and saying that we're absolved from responsibility for those, there is lots of data available about increasing climate risks, and so architects and other people involved in buildings are now expected to think about those, inform their clients about them, and let their client make a decision about whether or not they want to take action on it. But architects have a higher standard of care now. Fortunately, AIA has made a number of resources available to help architects with this. One of those is the Resilience Product Process Guide and the Hazard and Climate Risk User's Guide and Form Acknowledgement. So that last one is actually a great form that helps an architect understand, how do I discuss this with my client, and how do I make sure that they make the decision as opposed to me about what resilience measures we incorporate into the project. So it's a form of protection for architects against that standard of care requirement. I'm most excited that just this year, HKS architects in collaboration with the AIA came out with the Resilience Design Toolkit, which walks through the whole process from early project planning through design and construction and into operation and post-occupancy evaluation, talking about the steps to incorporating resilience into a project and providing some resources to assist with that. So I invite you to check that out, and it's a good general tool to take you through the process if you're not familiar with it and you want to learn more after my talk today. Just focusing this back on buildings and what resilience means in buildings, I want to talk about 3 aspects of what makes a resilient building. The first one has to do with building safety and security. That's kind of the things that are covered by building code. we want the building to keep the occupants safe during a hazard event, and so we need to plan and design and construct to do that. However, building integrity is another part of this. Ideally, we'd like the building to come through maybe with some minor damage that we can't anticipate everything, but to be reparable and useful again, as opposed to having to be torn down. That's another sustainability issue when we have to tear down buildings after hazard events, rip out all the sheetrock or completely demolish them. And so designing for building integrity, easy durability, hardness, and easy reparability is a part of a resilient building. And one of the things I'll note, given our context here, there are lots of metal building products that help with that. In terms of fire resistance and wind resistance and durability, metal building can actually be pretty good in terms of this building integrity piece. The last piece is building functionality. Now, it's easy to think about this for a hospital, a fire station, other public safety buildings. Those have to be operational during and after a hazard event. And that's important. But maybe we need to think more about resilience in other aspects. Other public functions might need to be operational to help with the relief and recovery effort after a hazard event, and so maybe City Hall and the city office buildings need to be resilient as well. We need schools that can double as shelters for people, and so our schools need to be resilient. And a community can't recover until kids can back to school, so we also don't want to have to tear down the schools. We need schools to be resilient. And one that I think is really important that most people overlook is certain types of housing, especially senior housing and housing for disabled people. We can't easily evacuate people, and so a standard of safe enough to stay might be what we need to be thinking about in terms of elderly housing and disabled housing and other housing for people with vulnerable populations. So this last piece about building functionality, I think, is the ultimate of what resilience means. One example of this is a project I was involved in supporting the owner in developing their standards, the Oregon Treasury Resilience Building. Most people don't think about the Treasury much and its function, but in the state of Oregon and other states, they're critical to getting funds out, whether it's keeping the state running after a hazard event or helping with recovery efforts. And so a functioning Treasury is something we might all not think about but would rely on. So the Oregon Treasury recognized that with Oregon, which is my state where I've come from, having a potential 9 magnitude earthquake in the next 30 or so years, recognized that we need to plan for this. And so they set up a building that was functional day one after a magnitude 9 earthquake or other hazard events like wildfires and floods. And they set about to build a building that has base isolation, so it will take the heavy shaking really easily without damage, but also has solar panels, battery storage, backup generators with additional fuel storage so that they have emergency power for an extended period of time after a hazard event, and built-in hybrid systems so they could do natural ventilation during a hazard event, so they use less power for air conditioning and ventilation if the power was out for an extended time. So it's one great example of an integrated and proactive approach to making resilience. And they built this with, I can't remember the exact, but probably only like a 1 or 2% cost premium over standard construction. So they figured out a way to do it without convoluted public financing mechanisms. So to close out and leave some time for questions, I want to kind of make a few points getting back to this, addressing climate change adaptation and mitigation at the same time. We discussed how extreme heat is one of the most severe of natural hazards. The measures we can take at a city scale and at a building scale to reduce heat islands, things like planting trees, doing light colored paving, doing vegetated roofs and light colored roofs on buildings, serve to increase the thermal resilience of the buildings that we occupy so that they can get by with less air conditioning in an extreme heat event. And less air conditioning means, on a day-to-day basis, less carbon emissions associated with the energy to power those air conditioners. So adding air conditioners should be the last order of business to address increasing heat, not necessarily the first approach. In a similar way, many natural hazard events knock out the power for an extended period of time. At best, this is an inconvenience and slows down recovery, and at worst, it means that people die. So having integrated renewable power systems and energy storage gives us that emergency operating power after a hazard event so that we can continue operations and recover more smoothly. And if a hazard event doesn't happen, on a day-to-day basis, we have cheap, clean power that reduces carbon emissions in the buildings on a day-to-day basis. And the last example, similar to power, an emergency or hazard event might knock out water and sewer systems in a community, and we still want to have hydration and sanitation after those events. And not to mention, we talked about water scarcity events coming up in the future, and we want to plan ahead for that. So incorporating water conservation within and outside of buildings, as well as types of water storage and reuse systems, and low water sanitation technologies means that after a hazard event, if water and sewer systems are knocked out for a period of time, we can still take care of those very necessary hydration and sanitation needs. And on a day-to-day basis, we reduce those environmental impacts associated with city-scale municipal water and sewer systems. So kind of in conclusion, making our cities and the buildings in them more resilient is not necessarily cheap or easy. I don't want to leave you with the impression that it is. There's expenses and complications involved in that. However, I want to make the point that it is much less expensive and much less complicated to do this in a proactive and coordinated and systematic way before a hazard occurs than to scramble after a hazard event to pick up the pieces and try to rebuild. And so it's a worthwhile investment to figure out those challenges and find alternative financing and work towards it. And collectively, we get a more resilient buildings that are also lower impact on the environment and healthier for ourselves and our community, as well as more resilient communities. Just in summary, we know hazard events are getting more severe. We need to take action on this. We need to stop using our gut and start using our heads to think about risks and vulnerabilities and which ones we need to address. And there are public and private initiatives that need to work together to do that. I'm interested to hear what you all think about this, and if you have questions or comments or things that you've done in your own projects to address resilience. Yes?
I had a question. What do you know or understand about resilient hydration and sanitation systems?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
You mentioned resilient hydration and sanitation design.
Okay.
Can you just comment a little bit about that? Should we knowledge in that regard?
Yeah, so I'll repeat the questions because you probably can't hear them. So you're asking about resilient hydration and sanitation systems. I'm not an expert in those, but what I will share is there's a building that was recently completed in Portland, Oregon, that has a separate solid and liquid waste collection systems in the basement. It's after lunch or something. I'll avoid getting too graphic about it. They use very little water in flushing toilets, and they're collecting that waste on site and actually turning it into a product where they're actually selling fertilizer from the building, as opposed to paying to have waste hauled off or paying for sewer systems. So that's one example of a resilient sanitation system in a building. They also actually are collecting rainwater off the roof and treating it and so that they're running the building entirely off of rainwater. This project happened to use the Living Building Challenge as a certification system, and that's one of the tenets is net zero water use. So that's one example. There are other examples of living machine wastewater treatment systems. One of the oldest ones I'm familiar with is actually at the Audubon facilities in Corkscrew Swamp in southwest Florida. I have a greenhouse where the waste from the visitor restrooms goes into a greenhouse and is treated there on site. And they don't have a water reuse system from that, but I'm familiar. Actually, Oberlin College has a similar living machine in a greenhouse on the Oberlin campus that they take the water from that and reuse it for flushing toilets again. So there's a few examples. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, but you can also do black water that way. Thank you. Other questions, comments? Places you're incorporating this into your projects?
We see it as kind of following the money, like just even insurability now in Texas for hail, for like roofs and composite and hailstorms. You know, there used to be like maybe 40 companies that would write insurance, and now there's 6.
Yeah.
And so you just got to follow it. They know it. You know, they're leaving. They know the resilience is there.
Yeah, I think that's the insurance market is a key indicator of where resilience is needed. One of the things that I'm hopeful is going to come out of the greater attention to this is the ability for owners to actually negotiate on insurance related to their risks. I don't think the insurance companies are quite ready for that yet, but if they want to keep customers and stay ahead, I suspect that that'll be a trend that's happening.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. And I mean, there's some precedent for that. I heard an example recently of nothing to do with natural hazards, but one of the key damages that happens in hotels is people hanging their clothes up on sprinkler heads and causing flooding in hotel rooms. And I heard an example of a hotel that took measures to prevent people from doing that and was able to negotiate some lower insurance rates based on fewer incidences of sprinkler head flooding. So. Well,
that's what the metal is, impact resistant, so it gets a much lower rate.
Yeah, I think that you know, in wildland fire, wildland urban interface, the WUI, things like metal siding, metal roofs, metal decks, things like that are going to allow people to get insurance in those areas where they might not be able to. I'm not an insurance expert, but the trends I'm hearing suggest that might be possible. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes. I'm sorry, it's noisy.
Anything about fires, fire framing, steel framing structures being more fire resistant, technically documented for insurance claims?
So the questions about metal structures and their fire resistance increasing insurability, that's something I don't know about. I would like to know more about it, but I don't know the specifics. It stands to reason that they would, but I don't know. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I guess I'll let you all go, and appreciate your attention and engagement today. I have some business cards up here if any of you would like to stay in touch with me, and also have my contact information here.
Don't call my kids and apologize.
Yeah, thank you.